there's so much to talk about in that section there. I mean, there's so many things that I'm interested in. I suppose the issue is fax workers. Who are fax workers?
Oh, sorry. We've changed the name again. It used to
Right.
be DOCS, and now it's
Oh, okay. Yes,
Indigenous
sure.
Families and Community Services, and now they've actually merged with Justice. So it's actually just in the Justice Department because,
Right.
ironically, we can see all the overlaps between criminal justice and child protection. So they've just merged them. And it's also happened in the Northern Territory, trying to bring together these mega departments to manage people, but especially Aboriginal people.
Yeah. So that's interesting because I had talked about, I talked with a filmmaker who worked in Arnhem Land, the Northern Territory, who had worked with grandmother. He'd produced the films around grandmothers against removals. The interesting thing about this is when you're talking about child protection, like in the state of Victoria, at least I know in terms of the Child First legislation, and I've talked about this before, but the process was that if children were being removed from their family of origin with Indigenous families, that what should be sought next is an extended family, and then after that, a kinship family. And in failing that, an Aboriginal family outside the kinship group, and then failing that, finally, a non-Indigenous family. And when I spoke to Anthony Dillon, he said that was potentially a dangerous practice because it put too many barriers between children being put into foster care homes, more quickly. But I wonder if it differs between states, because it seemed like that was a good practice. There were problems because only anecdotally, I talked about this with Anthony, that Indigenous families, even extended families, didn't want to take the children because they felt like they were stealing children away from the family of origin. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think most jurisdictions in Australia have the Indigenous placement principle, which is exactly that type of scaffolding. Start with, immediate family and then, slowly move down the chain.
Yes.
I'm not exactly sure how effectively it's implemented in Victoria. I know places like Queensland, it's not implemented effectively at all. And again, because, for instance, if you've got any criminal record, that often excludes you as a family member from taking the children into your foster care. And so there are reasons why, people who would be good parents are excluded on other criteria. I think, I think that principle is important, but my first response is that there needs to be more resources to support immediate families. So in the system at large, about 80% of resources go towards the removal of the child and the support for the foster family. 20% of resources goes towards the family and restoring that family with the child in their care. And I think it needs to be reversed. 80% of resources needs to go towards strengthening the family, and then 20 towards the placement. Because ultimately, if there's not supports, whether it's immediate family or extended family, and if there are biases put in place, then you're going to move very quickly from the immediate family to the non-Indigenous family. And we absolutely see that across the country in places like Queensland.
I suppose
and New South Wales.
Certainly when years ago when I worked in family services, that was the idea, that the funding should be around keeping the children in the home with their parents if possible. So all of the resources in terms of social workers, psychologists, departmental workers around trying to do this. But obviously the model we had wasn't like that. But I wonder if there's a danger if we absolutely conflate stolen generations from the past with child protection removals today, whether that may be a dangerous thing for Indigenous children, because that there'll be kind of this tendency to not remove Indigenous children and they'll stay in dangerous environments before we have the resources to be able to make sure that they're safe and okay, and that vulnerable families are okay.
Yeah, I think when we look at the statistics, we can see that very few children are removed for abuse. A very small proportion in any state or territory. The great majority of children are removed for neglect. So I don't think if we slow down the rate of removal, there's any risk of increasing abuse. In fact, I think, what we're hearing are more stories of abuse in foster carers' homes rather than in family homes. So I do understand like what you're saying. There needs to be a huge commitment shift before those resources, 80-20 go into reverse. But I feel we can do a lot more with supporting families that actually probably won't require that much resources. Oh, sorry. But really are, so it wouldn't require that many resources. It's really about that shift in mentality where, we support a model of self-determination. For example, Aboriginal organisations need to be provided with the, I think, requisite funding to support families rather than child protection authorities, which have this long history. And you probably saw in my most recent article in The Conversation where, child removals were done very forcefully, including by the police. And that's created generations of trauma, and we're continuing that, and we need to really stop funding that model and look at a self-determination model where organisations who are embedded in the community, place-based, can provide more effective support. And that's how we undo some of this trauma, because I think if, certainly of the Aboriginal families I've worked with and the stories I've heard, and many of these stories are documented in the Bringing Them Home report in 1997 by the Human Rights Commission. We know that as soon as child protection get involved, it creates huge fear and anxiety for parents, and they become, hugely unsettled in that process that, works against them when the department wants you to, work in a certain way and be reasonable. It's really hard to be reasonable when you've got such significant fear. So if we shift the model and work with bodies that are trusted by families,